We are live. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. Today, we have a really special topic that I've long been exploring and really wanted to take a deep dive into, which is about the history of Canadian cinema and why Canadian film has always struggled to find an audience in its own country. And we are also going to be highlighting some different films for Canadian films for people to take a look at if they haven't already seen it. And my guest today is Geoff Pevere, who is a lecturer, author, broadcaster, teacher, and he was a media and film critic for the Toronto Star and many other publications. Thanks so much, Geoff, again for joining me today.
It's my pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
So off the top, I want to go all the way back to, in 1912, we had the Canadian Bioscope Company, and they produced the first ever feature of Canadian film, Evangeline. That did well commercially and critically, and then the company folded in 1915. So how did they? Do you know why they folded after having such a success with a Canadian feature?
It's been a long time, Robert, since I read that particular history. But as I recall, it was a question of competing already at that point with American movies, and it was just not sustainable. That was one of a few production companies that started up around that time in the silent era. But there was basically just no competition with American movies, and there was also probably at that time, going back to the beginning, already the issue of distribution problems, which have plagued Canadian movies up until this day. Yeah,
I know. I mean everything that I've been reading, that seems to be the biggest conflict and struggle has been this distribution and the cinemas, because even then during the First World War, because correct me if I'm wrong, but from what I researched, the infrastructure in Europe was really crumbling. So Hollywood had these men, Samuel Goldwyn, William Fox, Louis B. Mayer, the Warner Brothers. Was there just not that's enough people like that to really take that kind of opportunity here, since the war wasn't happening in our country. So right. Do you know anything about that?
Well, I mean, the issue at that point in time was that also when the American studios started up, and of course they were more or less up and running by the late teens, early 20s. Largely based at that point still in New York. They had yet to kind of move to the West Coast, to Los Angeles. But most of those companies were also, remember, vertically integrated. So they owned the theaters. And the theaters were kind of obligated to show the films that they wanted their audiences to see. And that was rarely, if ever, Canadian movies. The other thing, of course, that we could not compete with, and this also exists to this very day, the other thing that we could not compete with was a star system. Right. Very early on, the American movies understood that the engine that drives the entire medium is the presence of stars, familiar stars, the attraction of stars to average moviegoers. In the absence of a distribution network, in the absence of stars, you can begin to see the beginning of the phenomenon whereby, as I've said many times, the Canadian films being really a foreign film entity within its own country.
Right. Yeah. And, you saw in Europe that they moved quickly to protect their industries when the threat of, Hollywood was looming. They took control of distribution everywhere. I mean, why didn't we take that same kind of action? I don't know if you would know, but
well, one of the reasons is that one of the factors that plays into that is that we speak the same language as the American film industry.
Right.
Most of those European countries, pretty well all the European countries, this is not including England, had their own distinctive language. And they could produce, therefore, the films that spoke to their particular audiences, and they could develop stars within those particular countries. We look and act and sound an awful lot like the United States of America. So for the longest time, one of the things you have to remember is that we were considered to be part of the U.S. market, and that's because of those economic factors and those cultural factors meant that American movies would have the same appeal in Canada that they did within the United States. So I think a large language has a lot to play into it, which is why, of course, the history of English Canadian films and the history of French Canadian films is so distinctly different. Quebec was able to develop a star system. Quebec was able to sort of create its own audience over the years, speaking to particular cultural issues. And that was one of the things, you see, I think lacking those things, Robert, meant that we were basically hobbled from the beginning in terms of creating an industry that functioned in the same way that industries around the world did.
Yeah, which is what I figured, because that's what I was going to ask you next. Why Quebec has done better in terms of having their own industry, which I can understand with the language and recognizing that they were different.
Exactly.
Right. And this is something that I found interesting was Sidney Fury, who became well known in Hollywood. For anyone who doesn't know Sidney Fury, he did the Ypres File and with Michael Caine, and the Appaloosa with Marlon Brando. And here's a quote I found. He said, "I wanted to start a Canadian film industry, but nobody cared." And then a film that he did here called The Dangerous Act got good reviews. Was it the same old story about why that perhaps didn't get wider distribution, or was it just the same old? It's too much like our stuff, or it's too Canadian, or any idea about that film?
Well, that film in particular dates from the late 1950s, I believe.
Yeah, 57 or something. Yeah,
57. And see, by that point, there was still nothing like an industry in Canada,
right.
And there were no sort of distribution networks at all. So, and when Fury said that nobody cared, sadly, that was the case in many crucial ways. There didn't seem to be any sort of official recognition of the importance of movies culturally. I think the feeling was, as long as we were getting our John Wayne,
Right.
then everybody's John Wayne was good enough for us. And I think that so what Fury did, of course, was he went to England and made a career for himself there, and then of course moved to Hollywood. And that's something that you see occurring very often during the late 50s and throughout some of the 1960s, which is that film people who wanted to make movies actually then left the country. That was the case for Fury. That was the case for Ted Kotcheff. That was the case for Norman Jewison, for example.
Right.
There was no infrastructure. There was no industries to speak of, and there was no kind of theater chain that was likely to play these films. So this is where my former professor and mentor, I guess, Peter Harcourt, who died a number of years ago, but he was one of the first to describe Canadian film as invisible cinema, the cinema that one knows about if you know about it, but otherwise doesn't exist.
And when Sidney Fury says no one cares, I mean, do you know anything about what he exactly thought was a good idea to make it work here? Or was he just finding in terms of like, you couldn't get producers on board, you couldn't get money people on board? Do you know anything more about that?
I think it was, I mean, he got that film made, and I think it was also an issue for him of sustaining a career in Canada. I know that's why, for example, Norman Jewison left, was that there was no feeling that even if you got one film made, that there was any kind of structure there for one to pursue that as a career, as an ongoing thing. As long as the films were not reaching audiences, it was pretty hard to make anybody care. And at that point in time, too, by that point in time, Canadian cinema had been sort of corralled in institutional terms. So, and what I mean by that was with the founding of the National Film Board, 1939, that became basically the domestic studio in Canada for making Canadian films. But of course, there were all sorts of limitations on what the National Film Board could do. The National Film Board had an agenda that wasn't necessarily about promoting the cinema as such. It was what it was trying to promote was a sense of unity within Canada, a sense representing Canada to itself. I believe that phrase that was often used to describe what the National Film Board was up to in those days. So it basically, what it had to do is the fact that there was not a commercial industry, and the a commercial film industry doesn't just require movies, as you well know. A commercial film industry also requires an audience. It requires distribution, and it isn't hurt, for example, by a star system. We were basically, as I say, hobbled in all of those critical areas in terms of developing a national cinema.
Mm-hmm. And I just want to read, I don't know if you've ever heard this quote by the producer Louis Selznick, who said, "If Canadian stories are worth telling, American productions will be sent in to make them." Did anything come of that? I guess not.
Well, I've never heard that quote. That's a great
Okay.
quote. There's a lot of arrogance in that, man. There's a lot of arrogance in that. So yeah, getting back to your earlier
there
question,
is
like not caring. I mean,
right.
As far as the attitude was like, we're not missing anything because we have already. As long as it's not seen as an absence or seen as a lack, which is why, for example, critics like the late Peter Harcourt, whom I mentioned a moment ago, devoted their careers to trying to write about Canadian cinema and to try and kind of track Canadian cinema as not just movies, but as representing a particular culture at a particular time.
Right. Yeah. Absolutely. And, the NFB, of course, they began to produce, feature films like Goin Down the Road, which, of course, you wrote a book on, and Nobody Waved Goodbye. And these films, again, they were financially, they were critically well received. Wouldn't this have created a bigger boom in production here? Because even if you look at, in the 70s, they were making really documentary style filmmaking and European style of filmmaking, and people were really tired of the Hollywood studio films, and so we were making those kind of films. Was that not an opportunity to, let's make a star system? People are liking these movies. These movies are really, really good, and they're character driven. That seemed to be the appetite at the time. Do you know anything about that?
I mean, about that particular era?
Yeah, like, to me, that sounds like that would have been an opportunity to perhaps have a star system, or perhaps create a bigger boom, because it was, people seem to be more interested in those kinds of stories. So if they saw something like Going Down the Road, which is so distinctively Canadian and so obviously Toronto, wouldn't that have maybe had audiences even see things differently? I don't know if you would know anything about that.
Well, I can speak specifically to Going Down the Road. Going Down the Road came from an idea that was developed by the director Don Shebib when he was still working for the CBC. And he had done, in fact, it began as a documentary about itinerant maritimers coming to the industrial center of Canada, and their dreams basically being trashed and dashed on the cold concrete sidewalks of Toronto. And you're right. I mean, you're right in saying that a lot of the Canadian films of that particular era, I can even go back a few years earlier to the NFB production of Nobody Waved Goodbye. And of course, I should constantly frame this. I'm sorry. I'm not talking about all Canada here. I'm talking about English Canadian cinema.
Right.
In the meantime, those kinds of films in Quebec were in fact being made, were being seen by audiences. And the French side of the National Film Board was far more encouraging of adventurous films that reflected the particular culture of Quebec. And there was an appetite within Quebec. Quebec was sort of never more sort of militantly nationalistic than it was in the 1960s, for instance. And films played a huge role in that. So in Quebec, you have films playing a cultural role, as well as playing a cultural role, and in some cases even playing a political role in terms of developing identity. In Canada, you got your film made. If you got your film made, Going Down the Road was fortunate. It opened on a street in Yonge Street. It played commercially quite well for a few weeks, but after that, it disappeared until it appeared on Canadian television. I think around 1969, it appeared on television. That's when I remember seeing, for example, Going Down the Road. But there was no way that you were going to convince companies, for example, like Famous Players, which was the leading exhibition network in Canada at the time. There was no way you were going to convince them on principle or artistic principle that this movie, starring a lot of non-professionals that you may not even recognize, in fact, you probably don't recognize, is something that Canadians might want to see or benefit from, as much as the latest Clint Eastwood or Jane Fonda movie.
Right.
It was just not an argument that you could make. Making that kind of cultural argument, making cultural arguments, in fact, in general, in English Canada, has been a difficult challenge, because it is not a culture that has, I think, extensively embraced the importance of cultural expression as national expression. And also, we're getting to a point now where people don't even want to talk about national expression or nationalism, because it seems so sort of exclusive. And in many ways, it was. In many ways, it was. So the fact was that, yes, although those films often corresponded to what was going on as kind of a subversive energy and adventurous energy that was breaking through in world cinema was breaking through in cinema around the world at that time, those English Canadian filmmakers, as I say, for the most part, were compelled to leave the country in order to make the kinds of films they wanted to make, because they felt like there was no future. Even if you got that one film made, the follow-up was often impossible.
Right. Yeah. It's. I mean, I can understand that when you're up against money people. How are you going to convince them that this is necessary and important for to make Canadian stories? And just on Going Down the Road, I know that's a film that that you chose. I just so the audience knows, I asked Geoff to pick some different films to discuss today, and Going Down the Road was one of them, which is a film I really love. What drew you to this movie?
Well, I mean, I was part of a class in English cinema that was offered by, in Canadian cinema that was offered by Peter Harcourt at Carleton University eons ago when I was a student there. I had seen Going Down the Road on television, and I remembered it. I was probably only, let's say it aired in '69, so I would have only been about 12 years old when I saw the film. But I do remember feeling at the time, as I watched it, that there was a rawness to it. There was a sense of realism to it. And there was even a sense at that point in watching the film, it was a film that felt often as much like you were watching a documentary as watching a scripted feature movie. Right. So it stayed with me. By the time I got around to studying Canadian film, of course, you couldn't get around Going Down the Road. Going Down the Road being the exception in terms of its prominence, in terms of the audience that it managed to acquire, and in terms of the very, very, very specific concern with these Maritimers who come to Toronto, as I say, in order to try and forge a career and a future for themselves, and everything just kind of messes up for them. That was and what I remember at that point, when I first started thinking about the film seriously, was that the subject of the film, which was these basically largely largely invisible presence of these of the maritime community in Toronto itself, felt a little bit like the Canadian film industry. It was there, but if you didn't know about it, if you weren't around it, or if you weren't professionally engaged with it, you likely didn't know about it, or you didn't see anything, or you didn't hear anything. And so Going Down the Road was extremely exceptional in that it had a successful commercial run. And one of the things that is significant about that commercial run is the number of people over the years who've commented when they saw it at that point, just how revelatory it was to see a film set on the same streets as the movie theater that you were sitting and watching it in. Canada itself had not been, except for the National Film Board, Canada itself had not been under the scrutiny of movie cameras, which is, again, that goes back to the early history and the difficulty and challenges with infrastructure. But Going Down the Road, therefore, became also, because of its success, it launched, the idea of a developing English Canadian cinema. But the problem with the English Canadian cinema was that it was always having its breakthroughs, but the breakthroughs were never sort of followed up very often. And in fact, if they were in the 60s and 70s, they weren't followed up on. So you have a number of interesting first feature films, in many cases by filmmakers who then went into television or left the country, mainly because at that point there was no industry to sustain it. Making films, as you know, is an extremely labor-intensive activity, and if you don't have you can't continue to make films as Don Shebib did using grocery carts for dollies. That was not something that was as sustainable as it was a great idea at the time, but it couldn't really a film industry. So the process of discussing Canadian film, revisiting Canadian film, even revisiting the films with the National Film Board, a lot of that activity, which was, yes, very much coached in sort of cultural nationalism and the presumption that we needed a national cinema, those were things that were that was largely kicked into place by making it Going Down the Road.
What I love about that film is, things go bad as soon as they get to Toronto. It's not like they have a good time. Like, you feel so bad for them, right? Like, it's like the aunt won't answer the door, and they're in the Salvation Army, but it's, to me, I think it's a crime. I only just saw it last year for the first time, and I watched it again last night. And when I think of growing up and watching, the 400 Blows and Truffaut and Godard and even early Scorsese and Cassavetes, I'm like, oh my God, this is a Canadian, I was so in awe, and I'm thinking we had our own, of that style of like documentary. And I can't believe I only, I'd heard about it over the years, like, oh, let's go, just clips of, this is what Toronto looked like 50 years ago.
Right.
But I was just in awe of it. But it's such a fantastic movie. Wasn't there also in the early 70s? I can't recall who it was that they tried to lobby the government to have a certain percentage of films in the theaters be Canadian. Yeah. And that no one complied. Do you know much about what happened with that? Is it the same old?
Yes. Yes, it is. I'm already repeating myself here.
Yeah.
But the I mean, you're right. It's interesting for me to hear you put that film in the context of, for example, the French New Wave.
Right.
Films of John Cassavetes. That's really interesting to me because that certainly is a particularly, I think, rich and important way of looking at this film. It is something which is very much, I think, influenced by the immediacy, the guerrilla style, all developed in documentary. Don Shebib had worked in documentary already for a number of years. The cinematographer, Richard Leiterman, had been working in documentary for a number of years, also in the United States as well as Canada. So yes, because I mention that in taking up your point, it's also a way to look at this film which allows you to look at it in context, because there are many ways in which Going Down the Road is a difficult film for people to watch today, simply because the style seems so remote.
Right.
And I think that when you put it in that context, and yes, I think that, for example, Shebib, who'd gone to school in California, was one of the very first film schools in the world, I think, had gone to film school in California. He was steeped in those films. On campus, the showing of French New Wave films, of European art cinema, of the American independent film industry at that point in time, which was also kind of just getting up and running. was very much the sort of that was the amniotic fluid, right? That the film was basically birthed in. And I think that's a very productive way of looking at Going Down the Road, and a way that kind of around what might be some other hurdles for contemporary viewers to watch it, is think of this as basically an attempt at establishing a new wave, an English new wave in Canada, which never happened.
Right. Was Don Shebib, because I know he did documentaries before Going Down the Road.
Yep.
So as you say, he went to school in California, was watching those new wave films. So do you know if he had an interest in narratives at that, even before he made Going Down the Road, when he was making the documentaries?
Absolutely.
Oh, he did. Okay.
Yes. His idol was, and perhaps still is, Mr. Shebib is still very much still with us.
Yeah.
He idolized, for example, the films of John Ford. So you don't get more sort of classically Hollywood and in some ways conservative than that. He really believed in it. And I think you look at Going Down the Road, it's not likely to remind you of any John Ford film very, very quickly.
No.
It doesn't feel like a John Ford film at all. But that was his ideal. He did want to make Going Down the Road was a Canadian film about Canadian issues set in Canada. That was his motivation, was to make sort of narrative films. But he also wanted them to engage with certain kind of particular economic, political realities in Canada. And he wanted to work in Canada. He wanted to stay in Canada, and he stayed in Canada. And he had he had a long career. But I think he would be the first one to admit that it was never easy. It was not a choice that made life any easier for a filmmaker in Canada than to decide to stay in Canada and make films here.
Were all of his films mostly NFB produced, like the features he made after Going Down the Road?
No, actually, there were some NFB support. Largely, I think some of the films were made with broadcast agreements with the Canadian Broadcasting System, with CBC.
Right.
And this was also something that is important to kind of remember about Canadian films, Robert, which is Canadian films of that era, is that in the absence of a commercial industry, they came to rely upon the sort of institutional industry, the institutional opportunities provided by the National Film Board and CBC. And so it was the significance of both of those institutions in the various sort of development of Canadian films is absolutely critical. It is absolutely critical. And for example, let's step over to Quebec for a second. Quebec in the 1960s basically had a new wave, and that new wave largely produced by the National Film Board. So it could be done, but again, it looked like the advantage of language and cultural distinction was something that was really critical in allowing that to succeed as much as it did.
It's incredible to me, just watching it again last night, just like the immediacy of it. Like you feel everything. Like you feel like you're there with those guys. You feel all the struggles. Not necessarily that they're responding or getting so emotional, but just in the way he would hang on their faces, just out smoking a cigarette. We're watching the trains go by, or throwing the stones in the pond, and lying in bed at night awake. And God, it's amazing how much he did with just the looks and the expressions on the actors' faces. But has anyone ever tried to restore that? Because the image, I imagine, is from an old it seems like it's an old print that perhaps needs to be remastered, or I don't know if you know it.
The last remastering took place several years ago, around 2011. That's when the film. The film was released, was re-released on the occasion of Shebib's sequel to Going Down the Road, which was produced, I think, in 2010. At that point, that was the last time I think it was remastered, and that remains kind of the best version available of Going Down the Road. You can clean that movie up as much as you want, but for instance, it ain't ever going to look like Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. There's no.
Right.
And what's very interesting, I mean, just to follow up on what you were saying, is that what you can see in that film is very much the influence of documentary filmmaking.
Right.
Apart from the central cast, Pete and Joey, their girlfriend, and a couple of their co-workers, it's all non-professionals. It's all non-professionals, and it's all shot sort of on location. The cinematographer, who played a huge role in defining kind of what that film looked like and the tone of the film, was Richard Leiterman, who had worked extensively in documentary. So I think what you see in that film, what you're responding to, and those moments of just pure observation, which was something else that Peter Harcourt focused on in John Shebib's movies. It was the opportunity for reflection, the opportunity for characters to basically be inside themselves.
Right.
And that's a difficult thing to kind of capture, but it was there in that film. And if you were sufficiently invested in the predicament of these people, sufficiently sort of invested in that emotionally, it became a very raw, very immediate experience. And I think what you have to remember is the incredible influence of the documentary background of filmmakers in Canada at the time.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Because even the quality is, even to me, it's in a good way, is even rougher and grittier than say Cassavetes' Faces. I don't know, what was he shooting on. I don't know if you happen to know what kind of film stock it was.
I don't know. I mean, it was 16 millimeter.
16. Okay.
He shot it on 16, which was sort of that was the standard for even feature films in Canada at that time.
Right. Right. Absolutely. And I wanted to jump to Mon Oncle Antoine, which was another choice of yours today, which I just saw the other night. Again, hadn't seen it before, and really like that one as well. What brought you to pick that? Why is that an essential Canadian film, do you think?
Well, it's essential in a couple of ways. And on the industrial level, it's significant because it was so very widely seen. It was a National Film Board product that felt like it felt very much like a fully fledged French film, is what it felt like, if that's not a little vague. But the thing was, I remember also seeing that film on television, which is where I got sort of introduced to a number of Canadian films. Just finding that film devastating.
Oh yeah.
It's just emotionally so devastating, and yet there was something so beautiful and so simple about this film. And I think that Mon Oncle Antoine was one of the first breakthrough films, Quebec films, to basically find an audience around the world and make its way to film festivals around the world. So what you had then, in that case, was a film of enormous power, made with enormous skill and sensitivity by Claude Jutras, which spoke to, it traveled, is what I think the word that they would use for it, Robert. It played very well sort of around the world. And the predicament, again, was very specifically Quebec. It was set in Quebec during the Duplessis years in the 1950s. So it was historically very much set in an uncompromising way about a particular cultural experience in time. But it had all of those so-called elusive universal values that made it play, I think, very effectively and very powerfully wherever it was sent.
What I love so much about it is that you for me anyways, I was finding that at first I'm like, well, nothing's happening. But then I realized, wait a minute, there's a lot happening. You know? When you got to be really, and I like a slow film, or even where I'm like, what's going on here? But I was finding myself losing a bit of patience. But then I think I'll enjoy it more on more viewings now that I truly know what's going on between all these sort of masks that they're wearing, and then we see the uncle at the end. I mean, I did not expect him to crack in the way he does with his nephew, and I was like, oh, these people are not happy, and all the with the wages and working in the mines, and it's a tough film, but
It is.
really, really,
It's,
yeah.
but it's gorgeous, isn't it? It's
Oh
also,
yeah,
you know,
yeah,
it's also just an absolutely beautiful film. But what's interesting, because one of the things to get back to something you said about going down the road, that I think also applies to Mon Oncle Antoine, is the time that it takes to establish character, and that character and the establishment of character through environment. Pete and Joey
yeah,
going down the road are largely defined their own tragedy, their own sense of exclusion, their shortcomings, their dreams is very much framed within that particularly cold, dark, gritty, urban landscape of Toronto that Shebib captured in that film so well. Mon
yeah,
Oncle Antoine is also a film about a Quebec that isn't there anymore. Even by 1970, it wasn't there anymore. But it sees its story in the context of these people, of this culture, of this landscape, of weather, for God's sake, right? I mean, the snow is a huge presence in Mon Oncle Antoine. And it's just, again, as a metaphor, it just seems so kind of simple, but so powerful, which is this unrelenting dumping of dampening stuff
right,
everywhere you
right,
go, and riding in sleighs, and so that the time that the film takes to get to what you would think is the real story of the film, is time which is taken, I think, very importantly, by
yeah,
establishing atmosphere, by establishing culture. It observes the rituals of the communities in Quebec in the mid 1950s, and it does so in a way that does require certain patience. But again, if you take your influence not as Hollywood films, but for example as European films,
right,
the world had never seen much slower films than a lot of those films that were being made by people in Europe at that point in time.
yeah, yeah,
Those films were very challenging to a lot of audiences. You could send people to a Godard movie and tell them, for example, he was one of the most significant filmmakers in the history of filmmaking. But when you actually looked at the films, you realized that they weren't going to be doing any of the work for you, right? And
right,
so on another level, something like Going Down the Road, and Mon Oncle Antoine require an emotional investment and a sense of
yeah.
from the viewer that is ultimately very much rewarded. I mean, it's really totally rewarded. And then you might even argue that that was something that is very much perhaps a distinguishing trait of Canadian movies at the time, was the attention to context and landscape.
Yeah, very, very well said. And what really stuck out to me was when they went to get the corpse of the young boy who died. And when the mother was getting emotional, the uncle just looked at her, and I found it fascinating that he didn't have anything to say. Like, he didn't have the outward expression of compassion to hug her or say sorry. I mean, he was so kind of like, oh, someone's crying. Ugh, like, I don't know what to do with that, which
Yeah.
is very common, anyways, generally speaking. But I thought that really lent to the coldness of all of the characters' emotional life, and in terms of their atmosphere and how it all sort of intertwined.
Yes.
But yeah, a really remarkable film that I also glad that Criterion Collection have put that out.
Yes.
As well. I'm just going to go to, there's been a number of comments in the chat box here. I don't know if you remember Andrea Elizabeth Mitchell. I believe she worked on Reel to Reel for a while.
Yes, I do.
She mentioned, she asks, do you think that Quebec being French-speaking and European in style is why they have succeeded in having a great film and TV industry? I know we pretty much answered that, which is yes.
Its own language, yes, its own language, its own culture, its own self-awareness of the significance that movies have played, and certainly played at that point in time in asking questions of sort of national identity. And what's interesting in both of those films, and both Going Down the Road and Mon Oncle Antoine, are films about disappointment. That's a hard sell, Robert. That's, I mean,
Yeah.
you know, I
Yeah.
wrote I wrote for years about Canadian films, and I often had to kind of check myself because I realized that what I was describing, and often in terms of themes of Canadian films, which is over and over again about failure, about dreams that basically never come true. It's the opposite of The Wizard of Oz.
Right. Right.
That was a kind of, that was also for a lot of people, Canadian cinema was considered to be something of a just a huge downer. And
Mm, mm.
and it's funny because you don't look at you don't look at, for example, you don't criticize Ingmar Bergman for being a downer, and
Well, that's, yeah.
he was a downer. Antonio Godard was a downer.
Yeah.
And what was seen at the time was a kind of an honest reflection of the world as it was at that time. We weren't alone in making films that were critical of establishment, that were critical of sort of false dreams. We weren't; those things were also a way. And if you put that against, I'm getting away from Andrew's question, I'm sorry, but if you put that in the context of as I say, all of these other international movements in film, and you put that against Hollywood films. Remember, the importance in part of marketing Hollywood films, the promise that they're going to make you feel good, that you're going to have fun, and also that if there are any sort of issues at work in the films, that they are going to be resolved largely by the end of the film.
Right.
And this that has largely been the practice of Hollywood filmmaking and remains that so up to this day. You can see Canadian films are actually at that point are very much reacting to that. They don't trust that. They don't trust the idea of neatly packaged narratives in which the protagonists achieve their dreams and live happily ever after. That was just not some. The Canadian film industry, Canadian films, both in Quebec and English Canadian films, were very skeptical of that and very skeptical of the idea of there being any way. Loose ends were not easily tied up. These movies were about loose ends that unraveled.
Right. Right.
And I
But
think,
even sorry, go ahead.
no, I was just going to say that, you know, when you think of that in terms of a lot of what was going on in the 1960s and 1970s, a lot of the subversive energy in so many cultural fronts had to do with that deep distrust and that deep sense of disillusionment with the world as it was, in terms of a status quo that needed to be questioned. That also puts Canadian movies somewhat on the outs, is that you can't promise people a good time so often when you send them to a Canadian film.
Well, I find that interesting because then if you look at, 1969 Midnight Cowboy one, and it's very, very, I couldn't believe how much it reminded me of Going Down the Road.
Yes.
And, won Best Picture today. It's still very well known. It's put out on Criterion and was, a major hit. Which is why it surprises me when I see people still talking about those old films, late 60s, early 70s, the Hollywood New Wave. There was a real appetite for that. But here, those downers, well, maybe those films didn't do as well in Canada, I don't know. But it seemed like there could have been something. I guess it's not so cut and dry to suddenly create a whole industry.
Yeah, I mean, there's a brand new book out there on going down the. I'm sorry, on Midnight Cowboy. Sorry, I can't believe I forgot the name of that movie. There's a brand new book out on Midnight Cowboy, which is a fascinating account of the making of that film, and also the challenges that were faced by those filmmakers wanting to make a film that at that point was seen as so kind of radically at odds with what Hollywood normally did. But it's also important to remember that film was made also by an outsider.
That's true.
John Schlesinger was a filmmaker who was very much steeped in the documentary tradition. In England, he was part of the free cinema movement. He was a younger person of the free cinema movement, which was a movement that believed that films needed to deal with very gritty on the ground social reality. So the film, that was a remarkable case of a film that achieved the success that it did largely sort of in spite of itself. And I will never forget, for instance, just remember that when it came Oscar time the year after that, both Dustin Hoffman and Jon Voight were justifiably nominated for Academy Awards. But who did they lose out to? They lost out to John Wayne in True Grit. It was almost as though
That's right.
that was ultimately the last word that Hollywood had about Midnight Cowboy, was that I think you like John Wayne more.
That's a good point. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it's easy. It's funny when you look at film history, we're always looking at perhaps their best stuff at that time. And we think, because we're looking back at it, that, oh, well, that must have been what everyone loved. And it's, it's like, it's not, it's not always necessarily the case. Right. No. But I'd be curious in 30 years how they'll be looking at things, now, as to what's important and what isn't. Andrea goes on to say she's surprised we didn't include Crazy as a must-Canadian film. I love that movie as well. The Jean-Marc Vallée. Sure. Yeah, that's a really, really good one.
And it's also interesting to sort of, yes, that is. I think it's a wonderful film. But again, Jean-Marc Vallée and his contemporary. Sorry, this is my age is going. Denis, help me here.
Oh, Denis. I always forget his last name. It starts with a V.
Right. I'm sorry about that. Denis Villeneuve and Jean-Marc Vallée both did very, very distinctive work in Canada, in particular in Quebec, and now are established Hollywood filmmakers.
True.
They basically, they hit the end of the road nearly 50 years after Don Shebib discovered the end of the road with Goin Down The Road. They realized that in order to sustain careers and make movies on the level that they wanted to make them, they had to go to Hollywood. So that still exists. But yes, Andrew is correct in mentioning Crazy as a significant Canadian film for sure.
Wouldn't they have had better, because Quebec, has a star system and has a better industry, an industry that people, go to there? Wouldn't they have been able to stay, or do you think they just wanted to work on a bigger scale?
I think they wanted to work on a bigger scale.
Right.
And that's justifiable. For instance, Villeneuve in particular made some incredible films while he was in Quebec. But what I think probably sort of clinched it for him is when he made Polytechnic. And Polytechnic, which dealt with the Montreal Massacre, which is, I think, it's an extraordinary film, but it's a film that kind of meets the definition of films nobody wants to watch because of the subject matter itself. And I think for Villeneuve, that the making of that film, the critical reception of the film, which was largely very positive, was probably clinched it for him in terms of going to the United States if he wanted to continue to make films. Look what he's working on now, and has been for the last couple of years, is an adaptation of Frank Herbert's Dune. Ain't no way you're ever going to get a movie on that scale made in Canada. Ever.
No, absolutely not. Someone from Obscure Film Prods says Don Shebib told me that the problem with the Canadian film industry is that it doesn't have any balls. Okay, what do you think of that, Geoff?
It doesn't have. I've never heard it put that way before, but it's interesting. Yes, no, I think the Canadian film industry had balls. I just think that it's that that they've been kicked so often that it is. Yeah, I wouldn't say that that's for lack of. I'm not really even sure how to kind of respond to that. I don't think it's a question as simple as that.
Right.
I think if you look at a number of the films that we've already talked about, they're actually quite forceful in terms of being distinctive, quite forceful in terms of having particular artistic and cultural visions. So no, I don't think that's the issue. I think if you want to say that that the country itself has in some ways kind of equipment to support Canadian films, I think it's not the films themselves, I don't think.
Right. No, I agree. What about, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, it is if you're constantly using that a Hollywood model as the backdrop in which to compare it to. And that's inevitable because we grow up watching Hollywood movies. We still watch Hollywood movies for the most part. But that becomes, when you think about it, that is using that as the comparison for how Canadian films are made or what the tone of Canadian films is ultimately very self-defeating. It's not quite like comparing apples and oranges, but it's like comparing a big fat golden delicious apple to crab apples. That's the difference. We make very tough, hearty crab apples that taste sour, but for the most part, that's not the kind of apple that people are accustomed to eating.
Right.
When they think of eating an apple, boy,
Right.
that was a torture metaphor. I sorry.
That's a good analogy, though.
Oh well, yeah, thanks.
What about the era of the tax shelter films? Because you had the Silent Partner with Christopher Plummer and High Point, which were more Hollywood kind of films where they really used Toronto, setting it in Toronto. Do you think that was a good period for Canadian film, or do you think it was sort of made things worse, perhaps because a lot of them were unseen, a lot of them were, not very, a lot of them were very poor? How do you feel about that time?
At the time, it felt like the tax shelter was was Armageddon for Canadian films. It felt like that was where all Canadian films kind of, they went to die in obscurity. But the thing is that the years have, I think, correctly sort of shifted the perspective on tax shelter movies. They were seen at the time as an embarrassment. And at that point in time, especially when you had a number of critics who were supportive of the idea of a Canadian cinema, but whose idea, for example, of what Canadian cinema should be, was in fact Goin Down the Road, Mon Oncle Antoine, films kind of like that. These films that were sort of in many cases lower budget ripoffs of commercial American genres or big American movies, and the fact that so many of them got made in such a sort of cynical manner, which was to provide a lot of the investors with tax breaks. People
Right.
really care about the films, and what that pointed out was you could even have a so-called industry making commercial films in Canada, but without that distribution network, it was whistling in the dark. It was not something that. But I think it's changed for a couple of reasons. First of all, for the longest time in this country, and this was the English Canada that I grew up in, culturally, it was very conservative. It was very paternalistic. And it was also very much based in the idea that culture was something that had to be good for you. I mean, it was kind of, it was medicinal. That was its function. So when the tax shelter came about in the mid 1970s, when the tax shelter came about, it boosted the production of all of these films. The fact was I say, most of them were never seen, or they premiered, for example, in the early years of the Toronto Film Festival. Toronto Film Festival in its early years was a venue in which a number of these films were shown, and shown only once after their premiere, and they disappeared. But the thing was it showed that actually that's not something that, although certain films from that era have been re-regarded and looked back upon, the other thing to bear in mind is that, and the reason why we have to embrace the tax shelter in all its kind of sloppy and sometimes embarrassing glory, is the fact that it was the increase in production caused by the tax shelter and the idea of investment write-offs and huge investment write-offs for people backing the films. What that did was it established something that, for example, in Toronto particularly, had not really existed to that point, which was an industry.
Right.
That was the first time that Canadian films were being made on a level that required all kinds of talent, required all kinds of crew, and it was largely the tax shelter, for example, which set up the industry in Toronto, which to a large part hadn't existed. movies like Going Down the Road, Nobody Wave Goodbye, were made in a kind of a vacuum. They were made, in those cases, they were made in sort of institutional vacuums. But the fact is that the idea of making commercial movies and the idea of there being an industry to support different kinds of filmmaking was not something that existed much before the tax shelter. When the tax shelter ultimately collapsed, it left many, many, many people with professional skills that allowed the industry to a certain extent to keep up after that. That was the first time you saw something like a secure and strong English Canadian industry develop.
Because when I see, like I said, The Silent Partner and High Point, for example,
yeah,
I know that these were meant for tax deductions and to stuff like that. But if those films did well commercially, wouldn't anyone have thought, well, perhaps we're good with these character-driven docu-style movies, but maybe something we can do more of these silent partners where it's distinctively Canadian and Toronto, and maybe people will start to look at the industry here differently. Did anyone start to think, why don't we have more of these Spielberg kind of things to find a middle ground? I don't know if that's just an idea from me. I don't know if what you think, did anyone have any, did nothing like that pop around at the time?
Oh, I'm sure it did, right?
Yeah.
I'm sure it did. I'm sure, and I'm sure, for example, you took it, some of the leading tax shelter successes are films like Meatballs,
right,
Porky's, of course,
right,
but also The Silent Partner, The Changeling with George C. Scott, which was made by Peter Madak in Vancouver. In British Columbia. I think the fact, for example, that at that point in time, the Toronto Film Festival had its own sort of showcase for new Canadian film. Doesn't exist anymore, but it was called Perspective Canada, and I worked many, many years ago as a programmer for Perspective Canada, which was an attempt to kind of create within the format of a film festival a showcase to celebrate new Canadian films and new Canadian filmmaking. Certainly, everybody at that point was kind of hoping that there was going to be this always elusive breakthrough that was going to change everything. But the fact was that films that even like, and I love The Silent Partner, by the way.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah, I think it's a great little film noir act.
Mm-hmm.
Great contemporary film noir.
Yeah.
But the thing was that without larger sort of institutional support for the making of those films, it was always going to be a breakthrough that was never quite reached.
So would they what would they have had to have done, do you think, in order, like, if people thought something was, now something's going to happen, do you think it was a matter of just needing a hell of a lot more money?
I think,
to keep.
Yeah, I think, money and encouragement. And it's interesting, for example, that if you look at the career, for instance, of David Cronenberg,
right,
begins by making sort of hardcore exploitation films, and is working within the tax shelter for a couple of his films. These were seen, I think that at this point, what the hope shifted was not for a very much an Indigenous Canadian film industry so much as it was the presence of Canadian films internationally. The emphasis became to being making films that would play internationally and play at film festivals. So no, I think there's always been those sort of optimistic people who looked at particular films and the success that they might have achieved and saw in that a future for English Canadian cinema. The fact was, it was, as you said, it was more complicated than that, definitely.
Well, I suppose, as somewhat so obscure film prod said, yeah, because they still didn't have access to the theater screens.
Exactly.
I guess that was another. Well, that makes sense. Yeah. Then who are you going to get to invest in something that you can't, get a wide enough audience to see?
Exactly.
Yeah. Right. I just put that together now, finally. You mentioned Cronenberg, and I know that you also picked Videodrome today? Why is that an essential Canadian film, do you think?
Oh, well, I think it is one of the most sort of first on one level. It's a movie which is about Toronto at a particular time in Toronto's history, and reflecting certain phenomena in Toronto. The arrival of cable television in Toronto, the arrival of city TV, the influence of city TV on the city in which the city that that city TV covered. All of these things are at play in Videodrome, and I think it's probably sort of the most nakedly Toronto set movie of any prominence that was made in Canada since Going Down the Road, as different a film as it was. And Cronenberg, of course, is hugely influenced by European films, hugely influenced by underground cinema, experimental film. If you look at some of his early films, they're very in the tradition of international art house cinema. That was kind of like what he was doing. So I think it's important. It's important in that regard. I think it's also important in the sense that it was such a huge failure when it first came out. And appropriately enough, then it began its kind of renaissance or rebirth as a significant film, as a recognized film internationally. It was on video cassette, and the film basically is about a conspiracy to reprogram people by in some cases literally programming their programming their minds. So I think you have in Videodrome, you have a film which is on one level a horror movie, on one level a science fiction film, but is also on another level very much about the difficulty of establishing a Canadian identity, the vulnerability of Canadians to foreign broadcast influence, and that by extension by Hollywood movies, for all those reasons. And it's also just it's just such a great, fantastically weird conception. It's Cronenberg still remains, I think Cronenberg is his kind of furthest out there, but it has over the years only very gradually evolved the status and following that it has. It was not that way when it first came out.
It's probably more relevant today than ever, just in terms of like living through our media, the phones now, and I mean, I'd seen it about 10 years ago, and I watched it again recently, and I mean, on the one hand, I was like, this is so gross,
Yeah.
you know. But then on the other hand, I was like, oh wow, you could see really what he was saying there, and I'm not surprised that people still know it today. It's such a relevant film. But that was distributed by Universal, I believe. So yeah, fairly.
Barely.
Okay, so I guess did it play somewhat better in the States? I don't know if you know about that or
No. On its first release, it was barely. It was. I mean, I still remember. You know, I was living in Ottawa at the time, and I was dying to see the film because I was already sort of hooked into Cronenberg's career and really interested in seeing it. But I had actually traveled, you know, across the city to a particularly remote shopping mall cinema. It was the only place that was showing Going Down the Road, and I was not Going Down the Road, Videodrome. And I remember at that point I was like one of the only, there's like 5 people in the audience the opening weekend for Videodrome.
wow.
It really was I mean, it really was on video cassette that film became the kind of cult phenomenon that it is now.
And Criterion Collection has also put it out. I think it's on the Criterion channel as well.
Yeah.
Obscure film prods. A modest proposal. Canada should buy Cineplex, real cheap now, and guarantee access to Canadian screens for Canadian films. Is that a possibility, Geoff? Do you think?
No.
I guess I don't know if you would know, but
I'm not sure. I said no rather too quickly. I honestly, you know, I do not know. Yeah, like I mean, the idea of getting sort of at this point, it seems to me an extremely dubious proposition to in right now being investing too much energy in the idea of a theatrical Canadian industry, mainly because the theatrical industry itself is
right.
now after a year of COVID and
Mm.
the overwhelming success of streaming. All of these things mean that we are once again in a state where the future of cinema itself is an open question. Is it going to be what we thought it was? Can it be? Can it continue to have the same kind of impact? Is it the same kind of important cultural talking point that it was certainly for most of my life? I don't really know. I don't know that buying up a theatrical chain that has more seats collectively than we may be able to fill is a way of solving this. But it is an interesting suggestion.
Mm. Talk to me a little bit about the OFDC in the 80s, because I know this created a real boom in production. And of course, you had Cronenberg and
Yeah.
Patricia Rozema and Adam Egoyan and Bruce McDonald. Their movies were getting standing ovations at Cannes. Was it the same old that they just didn't make enough money here because we didn't own the theaters, and so by the mid 90s it was axed? I mean, is that why that also came to an end, just in terms of not making enough money?
Well, that's a good lesson in kind of the importance of institutional support for the making of films in English. The OFDC, when it was started in the mid 1980s, was fascinating because what it was doing was it was promoting Canadian films made by writer directors. It was very much kind of what we once would have called auteurist in its influence, and it saw as the market for Canadian films basically placing Canadian films at international film festivals. And in that context, with the people like Patricia Rozema, Adam Egoyan, Bruce McDonald, Guy Maddin, whose films first appeared at that point in time, it was an institutional arrangement. It was an institutional support for auteurist films. And when that didn't pan out in terms of being the breakthrough that it was, what happened was the institution itself shifted its emphasis away from that, and the OFDC, I can't remember what it became after that, or what it is called now, but it was not simply trying to promote films and promote culture. There was the emphasis was more on the production of all kinds of media. So when that disappeared, I mean, that movement itself, you can look back and look at those filmmakers, and again, it raises the question in many cases of whatever happened to that moment.
Yeah.
What happened?
Yeah.
It showed you the extent to which those films depended on a supportive institutional framework in order to get films made. And once that framework was gone, then it became, a lot of those filmmakers struggled and have continued to struggle to make films throughout their career.
Were they hoping then that they would be able to get that percentage in the movie theaters? Were they looking at it in terms of distribution being a real essential factor? Okay.
Exactly. Distribution. Also, the OFDC was, as I recall, quite strict in terms of requiring a distribution arrangement before they supported a film. So yeah. And what happened with many of those films was, well, it's the same thing that happens with a lot of films that are successful at international film festivals. When you open them commercially, many of those films that do well at international film festivals are not conventionally commercial movies. So it's
right.
Canadian movies that failed to kind of light up the box office after a successful premiere at somewhere like Cannes. A lot of films that show at film festivals like that, when they are available, and if they are, now they probably go directly to streaming. But I don't think, for instance, that once you took that institutional framework away, then that moment also went with it.
And was it cut? Did Mike Harris cut it? I imagine just because there was no profit in a movie theater. I don't know. Do you know why that decision was made? I imagine that's why.
Well, I'm sorry, yes, the OFDC became the Ontario Media Development Corporation.
Right.
And so that shifted the mandate away from the making of these kinds of films. And again, it was the fact that it's what they, the Canadian film industry, even when it seemed to be kind of, successful in terms of making splashes at international film festivals, the films themselves, in many cases, weren't really all that commercial. You're not going to call Guy Madden's films in any way, commercial.
Right.
Adam McGowan's sensibility crossed over at a particular time to where he made a few films that were kind of quite commercially successful, but hasn't in a long, long, long time.
Right.
So yeah, unfortunately, boy, I feel like I'm being such a downer.
No, it's the unfortunate history, right?
Yeah, no, exactly. Yeah, yeah.
But I mean, they had quite a long. I mean, how long was that? That was around for 15 or so years, right? So they had quite a good run of making a number of
good run. They had a really good run, and I still remember being at Cannes for the first time. And visiting the Ontario Film Development tent on the beach, and it was amazing. It was very easy to believe as you were sitting there sipping whatever free booze was being offered to you at that point on the Canadian government's dime. It was very
right,
kind of stand there and believe that the future was as bright as the sun over the ocean.
right.
And but you realize then that it was a bit of a bubble. It was definitely a bit of a bubble, and it was a bubble that just basically couldn't be sustained once a lot of those films went back and tried to find an in Canada. It's what the problem, Robert, it seems to me that we're going over, or I'm going over and over again about, is the fact that there was no follow up for Canadian films. There was
Right.
once you made that first film, if you made that first film, even if it went to a film festival and did well, there was a question of getting the film seen by Canadians, and if there wasn't the distribution network, Canadian films at that point, because they were made on sort of a lower budgets, because they were made by writer directors, were very particular, not necessarily conventional experiences in going to movies. So that required a network that was not only just showing Canadian films, but was sensitive to the way that Canadian films were marketed and the way that Canadian films were positioned in the marketplace. We didn't have that either. So kind of throw a lot of those films out into what was a very meager distribution opportunity in Canada at the time meant that the films played rarely, they weren't seen all that often, and if you were not, as I was, professionally engaged with Canadian films,
Right.
they became something that you either didn't know about or had to do an awful lot of searching for in order to see. And when you think about it, nobody has to search or seek out, in fact, less than ever, a Hollywood movie, right? They're there. Now all we have to do is turn on our phones, turn on our television sets, make the decision to download something or stream it, and there it is. But
Right.
the fact is, Canadian films have always it has meant, for the longest time, writing about Canadian film, talking about Canadian film, as I did, it was it was work. It was uphill work. You'd think that writing movie reviews or whatever, as I did for so many years, would be kind of good and kind of fun, and it was at some points kind of good and kind of fun. But the other sort of my sidebar interest, which was in Canadian film, it was always, you felt like you were swimming upstream. That was that. Yeah.
What did the OFDC hope for in terms, like, did they hope that, did they work towards, again, the same mold of getting the government to do something about the theater distribution, or was it, I mean, I imagine that they had tried to do something with those marketing, with that distribution,
Yeah.
that was just way too damn hard. I mean, I don't know how much you may have already answered that, but I don't know if you know much more about that.
No, I do think, yes, I do think that what the OFDC model sort of came up against was that after having succeeded in promoting a number of films and filmmakers at crucial stages of their careers and promoting what we would largely recognize as an independent cinema, right? Canadian films are their own form of independent filmmaking. But that required more, the FDC, the OFDC could help get the films made, could help get the place of the films in film festivals, but when it came to distribution networks, there were distributors available in Canada at the time, but they tended to be very, very small, really
Right.
small. And the films were lucky, and you needed to have the kinds of cinemas, for example, that showed small independent films available to. And then you had to convince people who were accustomed to seeing Hollywood movies to go to. Now, Canadians were making at that point art house films, and that was the strategy of the OFDC at the time, was to support that, but it ultimately turned out to be unsustainable.
Right. Yeah, that's quite the quite the challenge. And when you went to, I read that you went to Paris in 1992 and you wrote Middle of Nowhere, Ontario movies after 1980. Did you do that just so to raise more awareness internationally about what was going on in Canada and how there was a real boom in Canadian filmmakers?
Yes, yeah. I think the thing that has always and I'm going over and over it today, but the thing to me that was always sort of a motivating factor was that these films, in many cases, when they were good, they were as good as films that were being made anywhere in the world.
Right.
The fact that you had to kind of make the case for them all the time, that you had to, in many cases, it didn't matter how much you talked about them, you were introducing the idea of watching Canadian films to people. That was something that was, at that point in time, writing that far back, that even then you can see in the title Middle of Nowhere that I'm thinking about Canadian films as an absence. And yeah.
What was the reaction there to what you said?
Well, the reaction. I mean, I've never talked to sort of a huge audience, and I've never intended on sort of reaching and speaking to a huge audience. I tend to presume that when I was writing about Canadian film, that there were people out there that had an interest in it, and had an interest in it in the way that I did, which was from the perspective that it is simply there's some kind of cosmic unfairness at work here, where these films can be as good and held up with any films from anywhere else in the country, but still weren't finding that, weren't able to sustain themselves as an industry or as a continuum. For filmmakers, filmmakers would make first films, and in many cases what happened with those films who made first films at that time was they either sought refuge in a more secure form of production, television, or they left the country, or what they came to I know, for example, they came to, in some ways, also depend. It was absolutely critically important for Canadian films at that point in time to find a venue in an international festival, whether it was Berlin or it was Venice, or the gold standard being the Cannes Film Festival. The fact was that all of those films, the fact was that the discussion of Canadian film itself was actually pretty small, and avid people like myself, kind of stuck with it. But I think we've always realized that when you're talking about Canadian film, when you're trying to interest people in Canadian film, it continues to remain a sort of, I think, an uphill battle.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I wanted to ask, Hardcore Logo was another Bruce McDonald film you picked today. Why is that an essential Canadian film?
Well, I mean, that's an example of a film that actually did find interest in in America. It was picked up for distribution by Quentin Tarantino's.
I read that, yeah.
Yes. When it was released in 1995, I love that film because, first of all, the subject matter, which is aging punk rockers, is something that speaks to me on a very sort of deep level. But
yeah.
Also loved about Hardcore Logo is that in its sense it's about a group of people who have a dream, and their dream is to get back to the glory days of when they were a punk band, and hopefully this was going to occur over the course of a tour they were taking through to different cities in the West. And the fact that these guys are on the road, the fact that these guys have dreams that don't pan out for them. It turns out to be far more complicated than it was. And the fact that the movie was made in a mock documentary style, for me, it seemed so very Canadian in its way. The influences, the interest, the depiction, part documentary, part feature, the notion of individuals struggling to find their voice, the notion of individuals somewhat lost in this landscape, looking for something that never quite comes true for them, in a package that is in many cases very exciting and hilarious as well, meant to me that I felt that film was kind of a revelation. And I thought that, the fact that it appeared the same year and right around the same time that another masterpiece, Canadian masterpiece, which was David Cronenberg's Crash, came out.
Crash, yeah.
That was probably the last moment with 95. It's the last moment that I got suckered. The last moment that I thought, wow, this is really going to lead to something.
Right.
And it led to a very illustrious career. For example, David Cronenberg already had an illustrious career, and it allowed Bruce McDonald to remain in production within Canada for the course of his career. But again, looking at Bruce McDonald's career, if he didn't do as much television as he has over the years, I think he probably would have walked away from making movies. Yeah.
That's such. Yeah, that's another film when you said you wanted to talk about. I hadn't seen before, and I must admit I hadn't heard of. I knew Bruce McDonald, of course, but yeah, I mean, I saw it the other night, and geez, I mean, it's hard to believe that they're actors,
I know.
and like they're all so. Well, I know that the lead he is a musician, and he was just. He was just phenomenal. I mean, and I loved how he was covering up his fears of losing the band and losing the guitar player, and in very funny ways, like asking about what are you going to do when you're 45? It's like, well, it depends on my alcoholism. Just so always he was quick-witted, quick with the humor. But yeah, I mean, it was, but it's sort of there's something about these guys in a truck when they're playing that movie game, and there was something sort of romantic about the fact that perhaps they're all heading, into broken dreams, but just all of them in it together at that time under that truck, not knowing what's next, and they're all getting older. There's something I found very touching about that.
There is
even though it's sad at the same time, but what a fantastic movie. Andrea says, it's Canada's This Is Spinal Tap. Yeah, I mean, you couldn't help but see the connection.
No, exactly. Yes, yeah. No, it's a fantastic movie. It's fantastic.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I know that's one. If you're if you have a library card, you can watch it on the Toronto Public Library streaming service, Hoopla. So that's a really, really great film.
Again, thank you for our institutions. Let's thank the libraries for carrying Canadian movies.
Yeah, absolutely. And even, speaking of library, your book here I got at the library.
Yeah, there you go.
At the Toronto Public Library, which
find books that I've been involved in, you either have to go online and find used copies or go to the library. It's work. It's work. It's constantly, I look at, Hollywood is this kind of torrential, constant stream, strong current of things heading into Canada from the United States. And so every once in a while, what we do is put these canoes into the water and try to paddle in the opposite direction, simply try to paddle across. Fighting the force of that torrent is something which is not easy to do.
Oh God, yeah, no, absolutely not. Which led me to we have this term that's been coined here now, like Toronto being Hollywood North, with all the American productions. Of course, what you talk about in your book, of course, they set Toronto often as Chicago or New York, or they use our studios for their interiors. Do you think did this sort of come about in a sort of, if you can't beat them, join them kind of mentality? Do you think, or why do you think, or is it mainly because of the dollar? The dollar being lower here, that we shoot so much here that's American more than ever. So Do you think that was sort of the attitude? We'll just join them, and this is the best we can do.
I think, well, yeah, I think so. I mean, although there were always filmmakers who were more kind of ambitious than that,
Yeah.
I think yeah, there was, and of course, what's interesting is that the term Hollywood North was originally, as I heard it, it was a denigrating term. It was a term that said that suggested that Canadian movies couldn't help but scale limitations of Hollywood movies because that's what they wanted to do. That was their ambition. We don't need the Hollywood North. I think what we've learned over the years, if we learned anything, it's that we can't establish a Hollywood North because you don't need any more Hollywood. The one Hollywood that's there, it exists in its way. It's undergoing many sorts of critical upheavals at the moment, but it's going to find its way, and it's going to remain as popular and as powerful, I think, as it always was in whatever entity it is. But no, I think at some point in time, yes, the idea for Hollywood North was, yeah, let's see if we that, and that's where you get people constantly kind of lamenting the lack of a Canadian star system and what we need. Star system. I think that the idea of Hollywood North is a distraction, and it is something that is that puts you on the fast track to disappointment. If your idea of a thriving Canadian cinema is a cinema which is made in Canada, but which is also Hollywood, we're not. We can't get there. We don't have the resources. We don't have the population, and I think overwhelmingly we still don't have the cultural interest.
No, I I agree with that. Which is, I mean, it's in my case, being an actor in the city. I mean, there's opportunities, but so often when you see that they use Americans for leads or even for principal parts, and a lot of the actors here are you'll get a few lines at most. Often in your own country, it's kind of like, geez, this is what you think of us, I guess.
Yeah.
But but obviously it works, but it's an extension of their big factory, right?
It's plant. Yeah, it's branch plant. Yeah,
exactly. I wanted to ask about My Winnipeg, which is the other film you chose to discuss, by Guy Maddin. Why is that an essential Canadian film?
Well, it's My Winnipeg is probably my favorite Canadian film from the last 30 years. It's I love it because it is, on the one hand, presents itself as a documentary about a particular city in Canada. On the other hand, it is so enormously subjective and delirious and weird and fearless. The thing about My Winnipeg is that it makes absolutely no concessions to anything really, other than this kind of like feverish imagining of a particular city and its history. There is so much invention. There is so much invention. The invention on the level of concept, invention on the level of execution, and the fact is that, I mean, the title, it says it all basically. This is not Winnipeg. This is Guy Maddin's Winnipeg. Guy Maddin is probably the most hardcore auteurist of that particular generation of filmmakers. Guy Maddin's career actually was supported initially by the Toronto International Film Festival, although they turned down Tales from the Gimli Hospital, his first feature film. The fact was that Maddin was probably one of the most uncompromising in the sense that I don't think he could make a Hollywood movie if he wanted to. I think he's made a few attempts at more conventional narrative films, and they, quite frankly, haven't worked. I love My Winnipeg because what it does is it connects with a particular city that I know particularly, quite well, but filters it through the process of dreams and repetition and mythology, and it deals with everything from beauty parlors to hockey, right? It's all kind of there. So it is a film also that is very much And it also, it's the rare film that found a kind of an audience, you know, but was largely through film festivals. And now Guy Maddin himself, he continues to make films, and he makes them sometimes at a ferocious rate, but most of them are you have to either find them online or be at international film festivals that they're invited to.
Mm-hmm. He created a real mood with that. I mean, there's something about it that was almost David Lynch like. It's so dreamy, and you know, he was talking about how they're people are always asleep, and you know, you couldn't help but laugh. But I thought the whole thing was I was like, oh, I didn't realize Winnipeg was like this, and then you find it's just more his take on it, right?
Exactly.
Or psychologically was how he saw it. But it's another. That's the thing about all these films where discussing that I find they put you right in that world. Like, you know, I find a lot of conventional Hollywood films they put you outside of it so you're comfortable.
Yeah.
But these movies, it's some of the most challenging I've seen, like in a good way.
Yeah. Exactly.
That just take a lot of patience and curiosity, and but yeah, I really enjoyed it. I know on the Criterion channel they have a ton of his movies, Guy Maddin, as well as Cronenberg, and that's another Criterion Collection release for anyone who is interested.
Yes.
You had mentioned earlier, the TIFF Perspective Canada program. You were the first coordinator in '86, I believe.
Yep.
And so because you graduated film studies in 1982, so did you already have a big interest in Canadian film, or did that develop when you were studying film formally?
I think the interest was there. I think it really kind of kicked in at university. The course in Canadian film that I took, that was offered by Peter Harcourt, was one of the first of its kind in the country. And it really did turn my head around. Like a lot of people who've grown up in a sort of suburban Anglo-Canadian environment, I didn't think a whole lot about Canadian films because there weren't any to see. They weren't there. And when I did see the rare Canadian film, and I remember from the early experience being kind of puzzled, they seemed somewhat less than Hollywood movies. And that was the way that I think a lot of people felt about Canadian film, was that this was the myth that if we were as good as Hollywood movies, then we would have a successful film industry. I think if we've demonstrated anything over the course of our conversation, Robert, that's the myth. That's not true. And it's
right.
Not fair at all. But so, no, my interest and my focus on Canadian film was something that was developed in my university, and then I carried that on to other aspects of what passed for a career.
Do you just to touch on your career, when you graduated in 1982, how did your film career start? Was it quite challenging to become a Canadian film critic at that time?
I think part of it was I didn't really think about it in those terms. What happened was that I was able to get my foot in a number of different ways. I became a programmer of Canadian film, and the first time that I did that was in fact in Ottawa before I moved to Toronto. I became a radio movie critic. I wrote regularly for an Ottawa weekly called Ottawa Review. So simply out of my lack of skill to do just about anything else, I found myself these sort of enterprises, and that was really kind of how it started for me. And what I also learned was that it was also easy to make a sort of a market for oneself specializing in Canadian films because there wasn't any competition.
Right.
I became the go-to guy to talk about Canadian films because I was the only person at the time, largely the only person at the time, who was doing that, and doing it, I think, with, as I recall, youthful enthusiasm.
Right.
And I would, I'd argue for these movies. I'd make the argument for the need for a Canadian cinema, for the strength of the Canadian cinema that we had. But I think that, no, for me, it wasn't, yeah, I mean, it was never easy, and I obviously haven't become rich as a result of it. But to me, it was something that was kind of like worth pursuing, and as long as I could find any response and any enthusiasm in any audience, it encouraged me to keep going. So yes, it was. I developed my intellectual interest in Canadian film in university, and that's what carried me across. And I think also because the fact that Ottawa is only has a limited amount of gigs available, the fact that I could monopolize about 3 of them also helped out.
Were you always comfortable immediately in front of the camera? Because you always, when I see you in interviews, you very much are. Of course, you've been on TV for on Rogers with Reel to Reel and CTV. Or did that come naturally to you?
Yeah, weirdly it did. In fact, looking back on it now, I'm probably more comfortable speaking to people in large groups than I am individually. No, I've always, it's something that I have always been, it's as I said before, I have a very, very narrow skill set. There's all kinds of stuff that I can't do, will never be able to do. But in terms of, I can talk about film, I can talk about Canadian film, and hopefully I do it in a way that engages people, whether or not they agree with me or not.
Right.
Yes, I have also just kind of felt, for example, I think we're probably having a more comfortable, natural conversation this way than we might be if we were sitting across a table.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, it's a good point. I find that as well. Talking to people, it is easier.
Yeah.
when you're in front of a screen as opposed to in life. This is probably a obvious question, but anyone who's a young filmmaker now, who's grown up with Hollywood films, possibly foreign European films, and more foreign films. How is it really how important would it be for them to know about Canadian film history? What would that do for them?
Well, in some ways, it's probably the less you know, the better, because it is a very depressing history, as we've just gone over.
Right.
It's probably that might be a damper in terms of one's ambitions. But I think I would say it in the same thing applies to, when I've been asked over the years, how do you become a movie critic, or how do you become a writer? What do you suggest, what you do? And what I always come back to is that if it's something that you need to do, if something in your bones, for example, you feel you were destined to do or born to do, you will do it. No matter what the circumstances are, you will find a way of doing it. Now, and I think that and very simply, it gets down to that passion, because you have to have that passion when you're involved in an uphill enterprise. Well, movie criticism itself is not an easy task to take. You don't just take movie criticism and go out there and get a job. I think that it really helps was to be sort of monomaniacal about it. That's the one thing that I think will help you get through what are obviously, I think, still hurdles. I must say that for instance, and I think this is revealing too, since I sort of moved away from active and regular movie criticism, I have also, for example, I'm not sure where you find Canadian films these days. I'm not sure where they are. I'm not sure what they are. There is no longer a Perspective Canada program at TIFF, which we used to kind of, designate the crop of new Canadian films so that you knew where they were and you knew where to look for them. These days, for example, I'm not sure. I couldn't tell you what the best Canadian films of the last 10 years are. I haven't seen them. They're not there. Talking now is probably, I'm more of a conventional consumer of movies than I have been ever, because I'm not required to comment on them anymore. And certainly what it seems to me is you still have to look pretty hard to find them.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And
which is why you're doing God's work, by the way.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, because for me, just as being at a screening a few years ago of a Canadian film, and someone asked the director, because they noticed that the money that they were handling, the actors, was American. They asked, well, why didn't you just use a Canadian currency if it's a Canadian film? And I understood the answer was, well, because it'd be easier to sell because it's such a recognizable currency all over the world. Is, again, to hide that we're actually shooting this in Toronto. So I wonder if more filmmakers saw, Going Down the Road or Silent Partner and all these films we're discussing, if to me, it would be important to keep showing the city and maybe some kind of change, or even on the streaming services now. At least we don't have to compete with the theaters.
Yeah, exactly.
I wonder do you think that's a better avenue for English speaking Canadian films these days to even stand out more as, oh, well, this is Canadian, this is Toronto,
Yeah.
or is that still
No,
still going to be complex?
No, I think, I think that probably the decision to make a film, for example, that is about Toronto and set in Toronto, is something which is far more likely to, I think, occur to younger filmmakers these days, because you have to make films about things that but I think that it's yeah. I mean, at the risk of repeating myself, I think that there is a lot of potential there. There is a lot of potential with streaming. There is a lot of potential with digital media generally. What I haven't seen, for example, though, is in any ways that those things have led to a larger presence of Canadian film. I think and then there are also like larger cultural factors. It's really difficult to talk in nationalistic terms about anything anymore these days. It's very different it's difficult to look at, for example, those films were not representative of the mosaic of Canadian experience, right? They weren't. They tended to be made by white filmmakers, and they were made by men. And those kinds of things are also just sort of not sustainable anymore. So I think what we're looking at is a different context. There is hope. There are possibilities. There are people out there who are doing things like you're doing with your podcast, and inviting geezers like me on to talk about 50-year-old movies that nobody's seen. God, I love you.
They'll see them now.
Yeah, they'll see them now. But just a reminder that this is an extraordinary history. And as we have talked about with the films that we selected for our conversation, hopefully there are exciting movies. There are movies, some of them may be 50 years old, some of them 30 years old, some of them 20 years old. But if you get a chance to see the films that we have been talking about, I guarantee you what they will do is make a lot of those questions occur to you as a viewer. Things like, well, why wasn't this a huge hit? Like, why weren't more films made like this? I think it is also critical to see these films and to see sort of where they are in their context, the sometimes very sort of detour-ridden routes that they have taken to prominence and success. It's really interesting that probably, for example, as you were saying, the greatest supporter of Guy Maddin's career right now is Criterion Films,
Right.
And so as long as there are things like that there, but yes, no, getting back to it, yeah, it's not just enough to talk about these movies. I would, if anybody went out and watched any one of these films as a result of putting up with this conversation, I would consider that to be enough as an opportunity to kind of plant the seeds for further curiosity.
Yeah, no, definitely. Well said. Just a couple of more I had here. Do you think TV has done a better job with Canadian content? Murdoch Mysteries and Private Eyes are purely Toronto, and generally audiences know them. Anyone walking down the street. How have they succeeded more on TV? Is it just a matter of because you don't have to compete with the theaters? I imagine.
I think that has a lot to do. And I think that another international hit, for example, is Schitt's Creek, right? That's a series that very well. Kim's Convenience has also found audiences sort of around the world. So yes, I think the day when sort of settling for television was kind of going into a form of creative purgatory is no longer there now. I think opportunities in television, opportunities for international sort of broadcasts and streaming, all of these also point to new audiences, for Canadian films. But again, it becomes a question of, like, how do you find them? If they're not picked up, for example, by Netflix or Prime, etc., HBO, for example, how do you find these films? That becomes it's again, it seems to me that you still sort of have to look for Canadian stuff, but I look upon the successes of those Canadian television programs as really critical and very important, because what they do suggest is that for example, it isn't a liability to make film and make series, in Canada. It's not a liability. It's just still remains a largely, at least half invisible process. So I think that, yes, that the television, of course, is significantly different, but I do think that in terms of the potential for the visibility of Canadian films that are distinctive, and are concerned with being, products of Canadian culture, is very important on television, and hopefully lead to more.
Yeah, no, I definitely hope so. And this is an off topic. This is very, very lastly was an interview I found that you did with Rod Steiger in the early 90s.
Oh, wow.
I really enjoyed, because I love Rod Steiger. I was just curious what that was like, because, it's funny when you started to ask the first question, I think he knew where you were going, and then he just sort of gave you his whole life. What was it like to talk to him?
Okay, it was. I remember that sensation was that at a certain point, it was almost as though I'd asked a question and I could have left the room and he would have given me exactly the same interview. And I remember he cried during the interview too. He cried.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, he cried. He was talking about his mother and he cried. And then when we got back, I actually rode in an elevator from the floor that the interview took place on down to the lobby, and I was with him, and he was still sobbing as a result of that conversation he'd had because of him about his mother. Let's just say it was one of the most intense experiences I had as an interviewer, but also sort of one of the most wonderful. But what it revealed to me was here was a guy who was so incapable of keeping his emotions, to himself or bottled up. I just realized that, this process of method acting is not easy. And what it requires is someone who is willing to really kind of excavate those darker corners of their soul. And Rod Steiger defined that. There was no daylight between the Rod Steiger on screen and the guy that I talked to at all.
Yeah, you get that. You definitely get that impression from that interview for sure. In other interviews I've seen with him, because he's so explosive on the screen. I mean, God, like it's unbelievable the depths that he can get to. But yeah, no, I thought it was both really engaging and also somewhat funny interview, how he just sort of unloaded.
It was. No, it was, yeah. I wish I could say it was my interviewing skills that kind of broke the barrier and got those raw places, but no, it was like he was waiting to get there.
Yeah, no, I could totally tell. But yeah, no, I really enjoyed that. So I just wanted to ask you just lastly about that. Well, Geoff, thank you so much for joining me today to talk. This is, an really in-depth discussion and long history of Canadian film and many essential ones that people can check out. And like I said, a lot of these you can find Hoopla. Or the library has the DVDs, or the Blu-rays. Criterion channel is fantastic. They have a lot of Guy Maddin and Cronenberg, and some Egoyan. A lot of his movies are on there. Quite a few. So they're there. They're pretty easy to find. I'll put those links in the description box. For anyone who wants to see more of Canadian films. And if this is your first time on our podcast, please consider subscribing. Just next to the description box is a subscribe button. Just click on that, and then click the bell in order to get a notification every time we release a new video. or go live like we are today. Geoff, thanks again for your time. I really enjoyed talking to you. This was really great.
Pleasure was all mine, Robert. Anytime. Thank you.
Absolutely. All right. Well, thank you so much, everyone. And we'll see everyone soon.